What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video, we're going to finish out our creation of a new trip. So let me quickly show you what it's going to look like. So when we come into our new trip here, if we choose any of this stuff, which we already set up, this piece right here is what we are going to be finishing out. So you'll be able to choose your trip type. So let's say if we do by plane, that will submit it, and then you'll notice that our trip is set up there. If we do a different one, here by train, you can see it's all loading as we would expect. All right, let's get started. All right, so the page we're going to be working on is this summary view, which is at the end of our new trip creation. So if you walk through that, you can get to this last page, which is our trip summary. So the first thing we're going to do here is actually add a new grid view, and we're going to do that right inside of our scaffold here. So after all this text, but before that last button, this we're actually going to use the expanded widget. We're going to be wrapping it in. So start with the expanded, and then inside that we can add the child element, and that's going to be the grid view. And start by saying grid view.count, and then that's going to give us a little bit of, or that's going to start off our grid view, right? So the cross axis count is how many elements we want going across. So for this, we're going to do 3. And then the scroll direction we can add, and that is going to be the axis of vertical. So we want a vertically scrolling list. Then a few more things to add here are going to be the primary, which is just saying if this is the primary scrolling, if this is like the primary scrolling method on the page, which it's not, so it'll be false. And that's because this is just an element with inside the page. I mean, I guess since it's really the only element, you could make it true, but we'll leave it false for now. Then within this now, within this grid view, this is actually going to take a children of a list, and these children are actually going to be the elements in the list. So these can have, we're going to actually want to generate a list for this. So remove that and actually just generate a list. So do list.generate. And the length of it is actually going to be the length of an array that we need to create. So go up to the top here, and after final trips, just create a new array, and we'll call this the trip types. And that can equal the different types of trips, and this will actually be a final. And this can just, or this will equal the different trip types. So for instance, car, bus, train. All right, I went and filled the rest of these in, and now we can use this trip types array to fill our list. So do the trip types of length, and then the generator here, we can actually just give it an index. We can just give it a variable index that we can then use below. And then we just need to go ahead and add these brackets here. All right, and then for now, let's just quickly return the trip type of that index actually we need to put this in a text widget, and that should do it. And if we save this, we need that comma there. If we save this, you can see our array is being displayed now here in the app. So really what we want though is we want these to be buttons. So if I were to, for instance, click car, it would submit this with that. It would submit this with that car value. So to do that actually is pretty simple. We just need to convert, instead of using text, we're going to return a flat button. So we can just remove this and use a flat button here, and then that is going to have a child, and we want to give it a column. And then the column is going to have the main axis alignment, and we want that to be centered, and that's going to get our text looking a little bit better in the middle of the screens there. And then the child widget here is going to be actually that trip types of the index that we were using before. And again, we need to wrap that in text. And now if you save that, and we need that comma there. Actually, we need that to be a semicolon. If you save that, you'll see it centers up our button. These are now buttons and it centers them up. Now we need to add the on pressed, so that's going to happen right after this first bracket, and that will be on pressed. And this will be asynchronous actually, because we want this to submit our form to Firebase. So go ahead and make that async. Now, pretty much we want this to be what this button down here is doing. So copy these 3 lines, and we can actually just delete this raised button. So place that in here. Now the only thing we're going to do here is we're going to want to update our trips travel type. So if you remember our trip object here, back in our models, our trip object has this travel type, which is what we're actually going to be selecting with these buttons here. So we already at this point have all these other fields are filled out at this point in the trip, and that should all be displayed in the summary up here. The budget's not displaying yet, but we'll add that later. So the trip type is going to be set to actually equal the value of this array. So we can just copy this, and it's going to be that same value, that string value. And then everything else here is the same. So if we save that, now that we have the on pressed, you can see any of these will work. So this, our location for Florence, if we were to click one of these, it will submit it and all is fine. So there's actually a few ways we can make this better. Let's do Washington, D.C. this time. And let's first start by adding icons here. So this does work, but it would look a little bit nicer if these were icons. So we could update our array, but instead of actually using an array, let's go ahead and use a map so that we can map the keys here to an icon. And actually, instead of using this here, because as you noticed back at the beginning here, we also are using this icon out on the front, out on this other area of our app. So we don't want to constrain these variables to just this one class here. So let's actually put them in our trip model itself. So at the bottom of this trip model, let's create a new method, which will be a map, and is going to be strings are the keys, and then the values are actually going to be icons. So just use icon like that, and then we're going to call this we're just going to call this the types. So with that, it will return the different types that our trips can have. So actually just go ahead and remove that. And at this point, let's go ahead and lowercase all these, because we don't want to store in Firebase the uppercase values. I mean, this is kind of personal preference, but I think it's cleaner to store all lowercase letters. And then this is kind of just, these are all going to be their own individual line. These are all going to be their own individual key. So let's see, it'll be kind of like this. Let me actually just do the first one, and then I'll just quickly do the other one. So we're going to be, the value will be an icon, and this is going to be, you'll notice the icon stuff is not coming up, and that is because we need to import material package into this file. So at the top, go ahead and add that. Now down here we have icons, and then we can do directions, have a lot of good icons. So if we do the icon of, if we type in car, we should have directions car. And then we're also going to give this a size here. And let's set that to 50. Cool. So do the same thing and give an icon to the rest of these. All right, great. So now we have our, pretty much all our types here are in this function on our trip class. So let's go ahead and use that back in our summary view first. So right in the build widget here, we can just add our trip types. and they're going to equal the trip, which is defined above, and which is that trip class, and it's just going to be the types, right? And then now that we have the types here, we can start to use them down below. So using the key values in the trip types here, the key is really what we want to print below. So again, if you notice quickly here, we're going to want to keep the text here. So we're going to use the key to just print that. And then the icon we can print as well as using the value. So we actually need to get those trip keys. So we can pretty simply do that by creating a new variable here, and we'll call it the trip keys. And then that will equal the trip types. And actually, let's make that lowercase. Well, so the trip types of the keys, and then it will be, we want to convert this to a list. So now we'll have a list of all the keys, and then we can use these keys to reference the specific values in each, for each one of these elements, right? So down here where we have the text, we're going to do two things. We're going to keep the text. So instead of using trip types now, we're going to actually use the trip keys, because the trip keys is now just a list of all the trip keys. So if you save that and do the hot reload, it should actually look exactly the same. We do have a error down here, so this is going to be the same thing. We're going to want to use the trip keys here, because again, the keys are just an array, and you'll notice that these all just went to lowercase, which is expected because we changed that. So now above the text here, we actually want to add that icon. So to do that, we can just use the trip types. So that's this trip types right here, this variable, and use that trip types. And then we're going to want to get the element for the trip key at the index. So it'll look like that. And now you'll see our icons are there. Let's choose this one as a train. And then you'll notice back here, we're not actually calling those icons, but the way we just set it up with putting them in this trip object here, we can go back to our home page view and actually update it to call in those icons. So find that file, which is the home view, I believe. Yeah, home view right here. And scroll down to the bottom where we have our build trip cards, and actually you'll notice that we're using so with this, we're getting our document snapshot back from Firebase, and we're calling it the trip. And then we're pretty much using the snapshot data like so, but it would be nice to actually convert this to a trip object itself, which it's not right now. It's actually it's a document snapshot, and then we're calling the data from that. So back in the trip model as well, let's create another new function, and this one we'll do it right below the toJSON, because it's going to be kind of doing the opposite of what toJSON does, where this toJSON is setting us up for formatting for upload to Firebase. We want to actually have another function which will format. It'll actually be creating it'll be creating a trip object from a Firebase snapshot. This will be creating a new trip, and we'll call it from snapshot, because it'll be creating a trip from a snapshot. So this is our new function right here. And then it's going to take one parameter, which is going to be a document snapshot. And let's call that the snapshot. And then this is actually not available here because we need to import the package for Cloud Firestore. So just copy that from over there, and now that should be fine. And this is going to pretty much just return, or it's going to create this new trip, similar to how we're creating a trip up here, but it's going to use the data from a snapshot. So We'll have our title, and it's going to be the snapshot of the title. All right, great. So these again are just going to be, this is kind of doing the same thing that our home view controller is doing, where we're just calling the snapshot of that element. But this is a bit more reusable, because let's say we change the name of this in Firebase, we can just change it once here, and then any other time in the app that we call this, which right now we're only doing it once, we can just format it like that. One thing to note is that the start date and end date need to be converted to a date here, and in Firebase they're actually stored as a timestamp. So just make sure you add that to both of those. So a little bit of refactoring here. So now that we have this, we can actually just use the dot notation, and we can just do the trip.title. Okay, so the trip here is actually our snapshot. So let's change this to be document. And then we need to define our trip, which will be, we need to define our actual trip, which will be our trip object. And we'll call that new from snapshot. Okay, and we're actually getting errors on this because we're not importing our trip model. So go ahead and add that. And now our trip here, which actually is going to be a final. Our trip here, we can use the from snapshot, and we're going to give it that document snapshot right here. And now we can use this trip variable with dot notation instead of using the parentheses with quotes. We actually don't need the to date anymore on our start date and end date, because we're converting that back in the model. So that's a little bit nicer. So just remove all of that. And actually this right here, this date formatter, and I know I'm kind of going a little bit back and forth, but this date formatter here is quite nice, and we should use it in our trip summary where we have our start and end date. Just go ahead and replace that. And the date formatter again just does need this INTI. I know I'm going a bit fast and all over the place, but I think you'll be able to pick up on that kind of quickly. That's not necessary to do if you don't want to. We're going to restyle it all later. But anyway, continuing back on the home view controller, just use trip.notation for all of these last pieces as well. That should do it. And now that we have that, we can actually use, instead of calling the icon here, you'll see we can just call the trip, or we can call the trip of the trip type, or of the travel type. And now this right here is going to be the string value of our icon types, right? So we just need to call that icon types, and really we should just define that up here, because it will be the trip type. And we just pretty much are, what this is doing, this trip type here, is we're creating an instance of this mapped object. So it's going to be our trip right above here. It's going to be that trip. That trip object we already have, and then just use the types there. So now that we have this trip type, we can go down here and use it, and we can say that we want to create, or we want to get the trip type with the key of this trip travel type that's returned from Firebase. So if you save this right now, you'll notice we're getting an error down here. All right, so we're getting an error here, and that's because we don't always have, we had some cards in here before we actually added this new feature that don't actually have a travel type. So let's just make sure that we have a travel type that exists in our trip type map. So we can simply do that by doing we can check if our trip type contains the key of our trip dot travel type. So if that travel type that we're saving is contained within our trip type, then we'll be able to, then we'll print that trip type. If we don't have it, then we can actually just use our trip type of other as our default there. And then we can actually just go ahead and remove that extra line, that extra icon, the default old one. And now everything should run, and you can see that these two don't have the actual selected one. All right, great. So now we're fully able to create a trip and save all the data that we need for each trip into Firebase and recall it the way we want it to. So looks good for now. That's going to be it for this video. Ciao for now.